When it comes to buying a piece of land, you probably got a lot of the same questions that most people have. How much money is it going to cost me? How much money do I have to put down? Where do I get financing? How do I know what I can and can't put on the property? I'm going to answer all of that for you right here in this episode. Now, if you haven't already done so, real quick, subscribe to the channel. If you have, thank you. I really appreciate that. My name is Wayne Turner. For nearly 30 years, I've done just about everything in real estate. Now, when it comes to buying a piece of land, people want to know, Wayne, where do I get the money? I always suggest people go to your local credit union or your local bank, your small hometown banks. They will typically loan you money on land because they're comfortable and familiar with the area. And for the most part, you're going to need 10% down. So if it's $100,000, $200,000, you basically multiply that 10%, and that's your down payment. And look, that's what you're going to want to do first and foremost before you do anything, because they're going to pull your credit. They're going to make sure you have the income to pay for the note. They'll typically put the note on 10, 20, 25 years, maybe even 30. It has a lot to do with your credit, your income, what you can pay for, what you can afford, and what the bank is willing to loan on the property and the value of the property. A lot of variables there when it comes to land. Each case is very different. Each person's different, so it's kind of a case-by-case basis. That's why it's so important to get with a local bank or a credit union and just tell them what you're looking to purchase. And they'll look at your credit, they'll look at your income, and quite frankly, they'll tell you really quickly, most of the time, within 24 hours, what you can and can't afford. In other words, what you should be looking for as far as price range of land. That way you have a good scope going forward to know exactly what you can purchase. Now look, that's the hardest and most stressful part, to know what can I afford. I think oftentimes people don't reach out to a bank, a credit union, a mortgage company because they're afraid to be told no, or they're afraid or concerned. I don't want to really use the word afraid. You're just kind of, it's like you don't want to be told no. It's just human nature. You don't want to set yourself up for disappointment. But just the opposite would happen if you go out and start looking for property and you don't have your financing lined up. That's why I say it's so important. Have your money lined up, have your financing lined up. After that, go to contactwayne.com. We'll connect you with an agent. After you've got your loan and everything approved and ready to roll, we'll get you a list of properties. You can walk out and look at those properties. But I always tell people, if you see a piece of property that you really like, get a copy of the survey. If you don't have a survey, you always want to make sure you get a survey. But walk the land, trek all over it, but don't just walk it when it's dry. You want to make sure you walk that piece of property when it's wet, after it's rained, or during a rain. And look, a lot of this stuff is going to be common sense to a lot of people, but some people just don't know. So that's why I go through everything and tell you, walk the property, get a survey, make sure that you can put a septic system on it. If not, can you connect to city sewer? Can you put a well on it? Or can you connect to city water? You just want to ask those things. You want to make sure you get copies of all that information. And if the person selling the land is not sure about that, and you absolutely want to purchase it, you can go to the city, the county, the parish, if you will, and they will tell you whether or not the property will perk or won't perk. Now, they may have to do a percolation test, and that's quite simple, where they'll come out, test the soil, test the land, and make sure that water will in fact absorb into the soil. If it will absorb into the soil, you can put a septic system on the property, and that gives you a thumbs up for a septic system. You also got to make sure, can you drill for a well if there's no city water? Most places are city water, but it has a lot to do with where you are. Your water table may be high enough if you're around water, around the Gulf Coast, for example, or around the ocean where the water table is a little bit higher, you can actually drill for a well. It may be that you're inland more, like in Wyoming, and you got to drill hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet to hit water. So it really just depends on where you are and whether or not you can get a permit to do any of those things. Now look, I always tell people what you want to do in any contract to purchase any piece of land is do your due diligence. And that's quite simply a time frame that you can do anything you want to with that property to make sure that you can do what you want to do with that property. For example, if you want to put a single wide home, a double wide home, if you want to build a custom home, the type of custom home you want to build, whether or not you want to put a well or septic or to connect to city water, city sewer, you got to make sure all of that. You got to make sure you have deed restrictions and covenants. You got to look at all that. Is it in a homeowners association? What can you build within that homeowners association? Is it in city limits? What will the city limits require? What will the city limits permit? So that's the thing you always got to check out. The last thing you want to do is buy a piece of land and all of a sudden somebody tell you you can't do what you want to do on it. That's very disappointing. And look, I know it seems really simple. It's your land. I get it. Leave me alone. This is my property. I just bought it. But it will save you a ton of headache and a whole lot of time and a whole lot of stress and money if you just take a little bit of time and do your due diligence when it comes to buying this property. Don't bring in dirt. Don't remove dirt. Don't do anything to the property. Anything you're going to do, you want to do in the future with this property, find out before you purchase it. That way there's no headaches. Because listen, you don't want somebody pulling up on your property and you're thinking, who the hell is this? And then they get out of the vehicle and say, you got to stop doing what you're doing on your land. They send you a cease and desist order, which is a nice legal way to say, you got to stop doing what you're doing on your land. I always tell people the best way to find all this out is to ask it, but you have to know this. When you buy a piece of land, if it's an inherited piece of property, in other words, you're dealing with the heirs and then children and grandchildren, they inherited the property, they're exempt from filling out that property disclosure because truly they may not know anything about that land. The same goes with a foreclosure. If you're buying a piece of land and it's a foreclosed piece of land, the bank is exempt from filling out that 10-page disclosure. And that's why I always tell people, go to your registered of deeds office, check with your county, check with your city, check with the parish, find out what has been on that property. Was there ever a home on that property? Was there a landfill on that property? All that information is going to be recorded. That way, when you take possession of that property, you know what you're getting into. Now, one of the things you'll want to check on, and you'll want to do this sooner better than later, and that is the flood zone. You want to find out the flood zone of the property. You're out looking at the property, walking the property. Before you even spend any time on that, you just have to know that there's A, B, C, and X flood zones. Flood zone B, C, and X, it's not required that you have flood insurance. Of course, if you ask me, I wouldn't live anywhere where it's a flood zone without flood insurance. But if you live in flood zone A, for example, you're required to have flood insurance with your mortgage company. Now, flood zone A, it's not the end of the world. You just have to know that it is required. You're going to have it. There's no option to not have it, even if you build. Like some people say, well, Wayne, I don't want to pay for flood insurance because I'm going to build my house above the flood elevation stage. And that's another thing you'll want to look at. If it's in a flood zone, does it have a flood elevation certificate? The flood elevation certificate will show you the base flood line, and that way you can build your house. In other words, the first floor of your living area above that flood zone. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, you just never know. But if you're in flood zone A, they're going to require you to have flood insurance, and it can run $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $12,000 a year. So I'm sure you will agree that you'd rather know this information before than after. So that's why I always say, grab a pen and a piece of paper, make a checklist of this stuff, make sure it's not in a flood zone, and if it is, can you live in that flood zone? Why are they selling the property? Ask these questions. What used to be on the property? Was there ever a home in the property? Was there a landfill on the property? Is there a graveyard on the property? All of this information is so relevant before you make that final decision and put the pen to the paper. And look, I just share these stories with you because I think it's important for people to know. I love the fact that I can shoot these videos. I have 3 decades of experience in real estate, and I can share with people so you can learn based on my experience and other experiences. One time I had a gentleman, he bought a piece of property. He removed a bunch of dirt and soil from the property. He got a cease and desist. He couldn't do what he wanted to do. He ended up having to sell the property. Had an instance where a gentleman brought in a bunch of dirt, brought in a bunch of fill dirt, didn't get permission to do so, was close to the water, Corps of Engineers, cease and desist. I have multiple stories, so I just tell people, listen, do your due diligence, make sure that you can do whatever it is that you want to do on that property before you sign on the dotted line. And go back and watch this video, rewatch this video, basically create a checklist and know that whatever you're going to do on that land, you can do on that land before you purchase it. The last thing you want to do is to have somebody giving you a bunch of headaches. My name's Wayne Turner. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Give me a thumbs up. Leave me a comment if you have any questions. And of course, go to contactwayne.com. We'll connect you with an agent in your neighborhood.